Hi friends, in chapter 4, Johnson begins to consider how the theory of evolution itself has evolved over time. In the end, she says, there is a center of biological reality, as she describes, of kinship and descent with modification that have held up over time as a theory, precisely because they can be observed and reproduced. However, some of the ways that the theory of evolution has been interpreted or applied have rightfully failed. And of course, we're talking about what is known as social Darwinism. Johnson rightfully acknowledges that the problem here is actually a categorical mistake. That is to say, it's wrong to take something that's a biological fact and deduce a social or cultural implication, and that includes religious. Darwin was himself ambiguous about the teleological implications or the goals of evolution. But what we can say is that he did fail to state that natural selection is not goal or value oriented. But then again, Darwin could have never really imagined that his theory would be used as a basis for economic and political theories such as state socialism, free market capitalism, colonialism, and racial oppression in all forms, pretty much, from Nazism to gender-based violence. And still the point remains that the moment Darwin blurred the logic of his theory of natural selection with Spencer's idea of survival of the fittest, and linked it to the process, to Malthus's process and his economic ideas of resource competition, at that moment he did leave the door open for this categorical mistake, that adaptations which were more or less suited to their environment would be interpreted in cultural terms of better and worse, which then implies social progress. It's a categorical mistake because the theory of natural selection was now being used to suggest cultural or social selection, or even divine selection. This is a logical error that is known in philosophy and theological ethics as the naturalistic fallacy. That's important to remember. It's the attempt to deduct an ought from an is. This naturalistic fallacy has existed since the beginning of time, and this is why everybody really needs to read and study philosophy and ethics, because we continue to make this categorical mistake time and again, even today. Since the beginning of time, people have tried to crowbar their knowledge of the natural world into a preconceived idea that creation is a hierarchy. Plato and Aristotle believed in the chain of being in which humanity, and men in particular, were at the top of the ladder. And right up until Darwin, this belief was maintained. So Lamarck and Linnaeus and the other naturalists that we read about in this book, who theorized about taxonomy and evolution, they still maintained that the relationship between species revealed some kind of divinely intended order, and that the increasing complexity of organisms led up a ladder of progress toward human beings as the pinnacle of creation. And this was really the paradigm shift of Darwin's theory, that human beings are integrated in a common web of descent that does not function according to a purposeful or goal-oriented hierarchy. Rather, each species is suited to their environment as it exists today. And this is why the social application of evolution betrayed the original point of his theory. It falls back into this naturalistic fallacy when we say that the ones who were well adapted to their environment are that way because of some preordained goal or design. That's the basis for a myth of progress that is the bedrock of economic, social, and technological materialism, as well as racial and sexual oppression. So we need to appreciate the fact that the atheistic nature of Darwin's theory, which is to say evolution is not goal-oriented, is actually the best critique of political, social, and economic systems of oppression that are based on the idea of survival of the fittest. So it's in the best interest, actually, of people of faith, I would argue, to understand the real, actual scientific bases of evolution that have been confirmed up until today. And Johnson in this chapter highlights some of those. First is the actual mechanism of modification and mutation. The Augustinian monk Gregor Mendel began to map genetic inheritance when he studied the ways that traits were passed along to generations of pea plants in his garden. The molecular mechanism for this inheritance was affirmed when Watson and Crick discovered DNA in chromosomal mitosis. And today we understand how genetic recombination yields changes in phenotypic expressions of genes, which leads to adaptations in morphology. And in this way, we're able to be precise about the mechanisms of modification that Darwin could only assume were happening. But even beyond these molecular realities, we've also corrected some of those conceptual assumptions about which Darwin frankly missed the mark. For instance, Darwin underestimated the speed at which species can evolve in response to environmental pressures. The example of the peppered moth is one of the most famous examples of adaptation that can happen within just a generation or two. Also, Darwin's eagerness to adopt the new geological theory of impermanence, which is right, actually led Darwin to underestimate the role of punctuated equilibrium and how catastrophes do in fact lead to moments of increased extinction and the arrival of new species. Advances in microbiology and comparative biology have also blurred the lines of distinction between species. Or to say it positively, it has revealed that species are more related than Darwin even postulated. From microbes to humans to horses, species are actually much more fluid than Darwin would have dared to guess. And Johnson points out that this relationality is also reinforced in our current cosmology. And following Carl Sagan's approach, she narrates those 13.7 billion years of universal expansion, gravitational heat that formed heavy elements that became the building blocks of life that finally drew breath only on the last day of the cosmic calendar. And that poetic cadence is almost biblical in the way that it describes the cosmic relationality of creation. That balance and equilibrium that are necessary for organisms to develop, metabolize, and reproduce, they're underwritten by a dynamism that we call life. And the mutual way in which life evolves is perhaps one of the greatest changes in the way that we understand evolution today in ecological terms. While Darwin accepted the basic premise that life evolved according to struggle, today we know that change is not only the result of competition. As I mentioned before, this is something that people like Karl Polanyi had thought about and proposed, but the modern voices of competition and progress co-opted the theory of evolution for more than a century. But thankfully today, studies in ecology confirm that adaptation happens even where species are not in direct competition. Rather, they change out of mutual benefit. And here is the point that I want to end on: the deep relationality and mutuality of creation. In Wendell Berry's eloquent words that Johnson cites, organisms die into each other's life and live into each other's death. And this exchange goes on, round and round, the wheel of life rising out of the soil, descending into it through the bodies of creatures. Darwin himself writes, quote, "The relation of organism with organism being, as I have often remarked, the most important of all relations." In this process, Darwin's world is as full of affinities and mutual dependencies as of competition and death. Johnson goes on to write, "Evolution is a relational process. The sound of mutual relationship is so pervasively present in the text that one might easily miss it. The beat goes steadily on until his book closes with its vision of the entangled bank. Its elaborate forms of plants, birds, insects, and worms, so different from each other and dependent on each other in so complex a manner. Darwin's view of life is bent on community," Johnson writes. And here I want to end where I began, affirming that this community does not have another purpose other than to nurture life. As people of faith, we can affirm with Darwin that this community of descent is not goal-oriented in the sense that there are certain species that are closer to perfection or a divinely oriented telos or progressive goal. To think this way is to think like Aristotle, that there are among us those that bear a better or more finely tuned image of God. But rather, the likeness of God that we bear is to nurture life. The image of God that we bear is not the rational Godhead alone, but rather the creative Trinity, the overflowing creativity of loving community that gives and continues to love throughout history in real time as we continue to evolve in our diverse ways for our mutual benefit, so that life will continue to be nurtured. So can we say that that is the divine purpose of creation? To dynamically love creation so that it continues to evolve, so that life will continue to be nurtured, even when we cause stress by trying to live outside or above this community of mutuality? I personally believe that is part of God's promise to the good news for all creation. And our current age of climate change, I certainly hope so too.